Ministerial session, and I am so excited and so glad that Dr. Hotle was able to do this session. I didn't want to overload him, but he so graciously accepted, and some of you may have heard his bio. Let me just give it to you again, and I'll probably give it this afternoon, and then I won't cover it again if that's all right. All right. So, but Brother Hotle, Dr. Hotle has served in a number of ministry settings. He served for 15 years as a pastor. He taught for 6 years in a Bible college and served as academic dean. That was right here. He was one of my teachers and one of my favorite teachers, and I'm not just saying that because he's back there. He was. I thoroughly enjoyed Dr. Hotle's classes, and as academic dean, Dr. Hotle, I still remember what you and Brother Liedler told me as I was standing in line getting ready to walk up to the platform to graduate. We were congregating back there in the vestibule. Both of them came up to me and said, "Now, John, from here on out, you're going to have to get your own sermons. You can't use our material." But they did provide me with a lot of rich material, and I deeply appreciate it. For 6 years, he has served as the executive director of the Christian Holiness Partnership. For 22 years, district superintendent of the Wesleyan Church. That was the Kentucky and Tennessee district there. He has authored 8 books and has contributed to several other ones, but his greatest love is preaching, and that's probably one of the biggest impact that he had on us as preacher boys was his passion for preaching. He has served as an evangelist in revivals, camp meetings for 23 different denominations, as well as independent camps and churches. He has a PhD in counseling. And not only is it a real treat to have Dr. Hotle here and for me to introduce him with all of this introduction, and I won't do what Brother Dewhurst did, but I will say this: not only is he a great teacher, a great man of God, great preacher, but he's my friend, and I count that very highly. Thank you, Dr. Hotle, for consenting. Let's open our hearts as he ministers to us and talks to us about the challenges facing ministry in this culture.
Thank you, Dr. Whitaker, and I had to kind of grin when he said what he did about ministerial material because the preacher boys in our classes, they were bad to do that and not always remember where they got it. Chris Cravens was another one of my students here when I was here, and a few years later I had him as an evangelist at our camp meeting at Jamestown, Cumberland Grove Camp. And Chris did a great job, but after the service that night, I said, "Man, Chris, that was good." I said, "I think you do a better job preaching that sermon than I do." And his face got red, and he said, "I couldn't remember where I got that one from." Oh, my. But anyways, these were wonderful years, and I'm so proud. I will be honest, we never were a large school, but I don't know of a school that produced any better pastors than this school did, especially during that era. There were some wonderful students that God has used and blessed, several of them that were my students. At least 2 of them, I think, are on the board now here, and so proud of all of them. I'm going to look this first session at challenges facing ministry, and I will tell you that what I'm going to share is not original to me. It is fairly recent as far as surveys go. It was published in 2020 by George Barna Research in the Barna's State of the Pastor Study. They sent out questionnaires to a large number of ministers. Actually, 547 pastors responded to the survey. And so these results are based. And when you see the percentages as I go through the slides, you'll notice the percentages don't add up to 100, and that's simple. There was not just one answer. In other words, they wanted the pastors to list the things they saw as the greatest challenges in ministry. And so, I don't know how many were on each survey or if they even gave a limit. But what they did do is correlate how many of the surveys they were on to try to gauge how important it was or how big a challenge that they saw it as being. And I will tell you that the numbers are somewhat skewed. I won't have the time to look at them, but there were several things, if we had time to dig deeper into the challenges that are faced in ministry today, there are several things that are disconcerting to me that do not show up in the number because the number is collective. But just to give you an idea of what I mean by that, the numbers were skewed by both the age and the amount of time that the minister had pastored, and they were also skewed by whether they were what we would consider mainline or more liberal pastors or conservative pastors. They were skewed greatly. Let me just give you a good example. On the question, or on the cultural shift to a secular age, which was one of them that appeared in a number of them, over half of them, when you look at it closer, those that were under the age of 45 and had pastored for less than 10 years, there wasn't a majority of them that saw that as a concern. But the longer they had pastored, the more that one troubled them. Just to give you a breakdown, for those that had pastored, while it appeared on 66% of the surveys, for those under the age of 45, it was less than 50%. For those that had pastored from 10 to 19 years, and let me see if I can find, yes, from those that had pastored from 10 to 19, less than 10 years, it was 47%. Those 10 to 19, it was 65%. Those that had pastored 20 years or longer, it climbed on up through the 70s. So those that had been in pastoral ministry for a time were really troubled by the cultural shift in society, where those that were under the age of 45 or had pastored less than 10 did not see it as a major issue. And in fact, I will be honest, over the last 10 years, the change has accelerated at a drastic rate. The changes in the culture, even within the church and even within the conservative holiness movement. You grow, how do I put it? When you live in an environment, you get so used to the to the subtle changes in that environment that oftentimes you're unaware of it because you live in it day by day. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to serve on a board that met every year in Los Angeles, California. And so I had to go out there for a board meeting every year for 6 years. And as a result of it, I was invited to preach in a lot of holiness churches that were there in Southern California. And I quickly discovered that the culture was so different there and they were oblivious to it. People that thought they were conservative had no idea what conservative was. It was a mindset. And I heard language from holiness pulpits out there that I would have had my mouth washed out with soap for using here. I was literally preaching a holiness ministerial meeting that was made up of what I would call mainline holiness churches and even some more conservative holiness churches that met in the San Bernardino Mountains at the very retreat center where Billy Graham had answered the call to evangelism years earlier. And literally they got into a fight one day, not physically, but they got into an argument, holiness pastors, over whether abortion was wrong or not. And I couldn't believe that anyone would claim to be a holiness pastor that would believe abortion was all right. But they had grown so used to it, that subtle change. I was invited to pastor a church there, and I quickly turned it down. I said, I would not move my family in this culture for anything in the world. Now, I am conservative by nature, but since I left here, and I always cherish my year, but I was always a part of what I would consider a mainline holiness denomination. And when I left here, it was because I was elected district superintendent in my home district. And so I went back home to Tennessee where God lives. And, as a result of that, while I have continually had opportunity to preach in the conservative holiness movement, and since even while I was DS, preached at various School of Prophets or Hope Sound graduation, various things, a couple of ministerials there, I am not technically, I hope you understand what I mean, a part of the conservative holiness movement by denomination. You understand what I mean by that. So I still have opportunity to preach, but I'm always somewhat of an outsider looking in. And I have been shocked at the changes I have seen in the conservative holiness movement that many of my friends seem unaware of. Because change is a subtle thing. And I'm not saying it's all bad. Some of it is bad. Some of it is not bad. I mean, I understand that. But society does affect us, whether we like it or not. And Dr. Dewhurst did an excellent job, and in fact, this morning shared a lot of the concerns. I was sitting by his father, and we were talking during his presentation of some of the concerns that I've seen, and boy, how true it is. We've got to be careful how it affects us, and we're so quick to adapt the methods of the world in fighting against those changes if we're not careful. I love that passage. I used to quote it in class. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but are the mighty to the pulling down of strongholds. And we always get in trouble when we adapt the philosophy or even the mentality of trying to fight our battles like the world fights their battles. But let's look at some of those challenges facing the ministry today. The first challenge that was on more surveys than any other was a watered-down gospel teaching. 72% of those who responded saw this as the number one issue. And again, this one was somewhat skewed because for those that were evangelical, the number was actually 78%. Those that were a part of a holiness denomination, though it was a relatively smaller number, it was in the 80s. But for those that were mainline, for many of them, it wasn't even half of them that saw that as an issue, naturally. But can I tell you here, again, we have to be careful. We, as holiness people, have always stood strongly on what we felt like was a biblical understanding of the concept of sin. But I have been surprised, even in our Bible schools, that there has been somewhat of a watered-down perspective on the concept of sin. And our theology of holiness will not stand if we do not have a biblical understanding and a hatred for sin. I had someone, I don't want to get sidetracked here, but I had someone who was a former student approach me not long ago, and they were trying to answer someone who was debating the matter of whether we sin every day and, the biblical context for our position on sin. And I felt like it was too much to try to answer by an email. And I said, quite honestly, the best thing you could do is read Richard Taylor's Right Conception of Sin, great classic. But I said, you have to understand our perspective, because in a way, we're both right, but we have to distinguish what I mean by that. In the Old Testament, there were three concepts of sin that were dealt with in the sacrificial system. There was sin as a nature, as an inherited depravity, and there was a sacrifice for that offered on the Day of Atonement that represented that inherited nature that is in all of us as a result of the fall. Now, I will tell you, and there is a Greek word dealing with that in the New Testament, it doesn't always exclusively deal with the sin nature. For example, a sin can be yielded to so often that it becomes like a nature. In other words, the word in the New Testament that is used, the Greek word, while it normally applies to that inherited depravity, we can yield to something so long that it becomes just like another nature. Alcoholism, for example. Alcoholism begins as an act, but there comes a point for the alcoholic where it is a driving force. You with me? It becomes like a nature, and the word can apply to that, where it is, it is a driving force. There is a second concept dealt with in the sacrificial system, the trespass offering, that dealt with acts of rebellion, acts of lawlessness. And of course, the New Testament deals with that, where sin is more than what you do, but it is an act of rebellion against God. I'm going to be in charge. I don't care what God thinks. And so there is the trespass offering. But there was a third concept in the Hebrew that refers to any falling short of God's perfect standard. And there was an offering that was offered for that. It is often referred to as sins of ignorance. In other words, we did something wrong, but we weren't aware that we did something wrong. Give you a case in point. Is lying falling short of God's perfect standard? Absolutely. But what if I tell you something that I believe to be true and it's not true? It's still falling short of God's perfect standard, but it was not a matter of the will. And so there was an offering that was offered for those sins of ignorance, for those things that I may have done that I wasn't aware were falling short of God's perfect standard. And even in the Old Testament, if it came to my light or to my attention that I had done something, I had told something that wasn't true, etc., then I had to offer a new offering. I had to deal with it. Then I became accountable for it. But I still had fallen short of God's perfect standard. Oddly enough, the New Testament is totally silent on sins of ignorance. There are only two concepts dealt with, hamartia and hamartano, only two concepts. One of them is sin as an act, or as John describes it, sin as lawlessness, and sin as a nature. But it's silent about sin as any falling short of God's perfect standard. Leading John Wesley to apply a couple of passages in Hebrew where it talks about, for example, Jesus dying for sin once for all. And the question is, was the once for all times or once for all sin? And Wesley believed that it was broad enough to believe for all sin. In other words, when Jesus died on the cross, he clearly, according to Hebrews, suffered without the gate even for our sanctification. He died on the cross to deal with our acts of sin. But Wesley believed that once for all sacrifice also covered sins of ignorance, or any fault, those things that were not a matter of volition or will. And so Wesley referred to them as sins not properly so called. because he believed they were covered by the blood, and I only became liable or responsible for them if they became a matter of the will. Are you following me? When I got saved, Jesus covered them, so I don't have to come to him every day and say, forgive me of my sins. Because those sins that are a matter of any falling short of God's perfect standard are covered. I do have to deal with the ones that are acts of rebellion, and I have to deal with surrendering myself entirely to have that nature cleansed. That's biblical in the New Testament sense. Wesley, while he admitted that those sins of ignorance were sins according to the Old Testament model, he didn't like to refer to them as sins, I believe rightfully so, because what happens is you begin to justify things that are a matter of the will. So that if I'm continually asking God to forgive me of my sins, then I am justifying things that are a matter of the will. I think that's biblical. I think that's wise. And so that's why we don't pray every day, Father, forgive me of my sins. But what has happened is there are more and more, even in the holiness circles, even in conservative holiness circles, that have moved towards that Old Testament model, and as a result, we have lost the fear and the hatred of sin. And our theology is in trouble when we do not have a proper hatred of sin. So a watered-down theology is something that we have to be careful of. The next one, let me see, I skipped one here, I believe. Yes. Cultural shift to a secular society was the next one that was identified more than any other, and I've already looked at that in part, but there is, and we see this is a problem that we all recognize. It's hard to imagine now. I visited my parents' grave in Hope, Indiana, last week while I was in a revival at Gnawbone. Reverend Dodrell, Mark Dodrell, who was here last night, been a dear friend of our family for years, and actually helped me when I preached my father's funeral and is buried there. I grew up in that little town, and when I grew up in that town, things were so different than they are now. Now, I know Hope's always been a conservative little town, a Moravian community, the oldest community, one of the oldest communities in the state of Indiana, founded by Moravian missionaries to minister to the American Indians. But when I was growing up in a public school, we had a Good Friday service every Good Friday. They would bring, we lived in an area where we straddled two county lines, and so actually our school district straddled three county lines, but nobody wanted us, and so we had our own little school system, the Flat Rock Hawk Creek Township School District, and we had a high school and a couple of elementary schools, and we were all bused into the high school. Now, they didn't have it at the school, but every year on Good Friday, they would bring all the kids to the Hope Elementary School by bus about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and we would walk by class to the Methodist church there on Main Street, and we would have a preacher come in and a community choir that, I remember one in particular that they always sing, "Up from the grave he arose with a mighty triumph o'er his foes." I loved that. And Charlie Biggs, who was our band director, would get up on that big pipe organ and make that thing sing while the choir sang. And after we had the Good Friday service, we would go back to our buses and go home. Try to do that in today's culture. We always had a baccalaureate service in those days where a preacher would preach a gospel message, and the teachers would line in their caps and gowns. And believe it or not, I was in the 10th grade in a public high school before girls were allowed to wear jeans to school. That's how different things were. And you'll have to pardon me if I get to this. That thing is going to get louder and louder, and I apologize. Just a moment. It's one of the joys of being a diabetic. So there we go. Now it'll quit. But there has been such a shift in society until now. Here's what troubles me. Even in the most conservative places where I preach, pastors would be shocked at the tolerance level of their young people towards some of the things that Dr. Dewhurst is going to share this week. We have lost that sense of absolute standard. God's word being the absolute standard. And even those who were raised in conservative homes, I've had them argue with me, the teenagers. While they would not say, for example, that homosexuality is right, they would be very disconcerted if we were critical at all. And it is a challenge that we have to face because, listen, the Bible, if there are no absolute standards, one of the things I deal with now that I do about 28 revivals and camps a year, and then when I'm home, God has been so good to provide a position where I serve as historian in a funeral industry for a company that owns a number of funeral homes. And oftentimes when they have no preacher, because I'm a preacher, just 3 weeks ago I was home for the weekend, I preached 2 funerals on the same day that I'd never met the people. Knew nothing about them, and I help them as I can. But it has been staggering. Do you know since COVID that suicides are at an all-time high? I mean, the coroner's office can't keep up. But they're at an all-time high, not just among adults, but among teenagers. And that troubles me. But listen to me. We have taken away absolute truth. And if there are no absolutes, if I really believe there was no heaven to gain and a hell to shun, and it didn't matter how we lived, we take away hope. And Romans 8 makes it clear we are saved by hope. And if you don't come out of Bible school learning anything else, learn this. God's word is the absolute standard. It is the truth. And everything has to be judged in light of God's word. If it isn't, we're wasting our time. We're wasting our time. Cultural shift. Number 3. Poor discipleship models, 63%. And quite honestly, even in holiness circles, there's been debate that's risen. You know, some don't like the term discipleship or the idea of discipleship, and it's all evangelism to them, and others have gone to the other extreme to where it's all, discipleship, and, that's important and not evangelism. It's not an either or, it's a both and. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but let me just suggest if you are looking for a good discipleship model, I meant to bring the name of what he calls his materials, but Darrell Stetler III, who pastors Bible Methodist Church in Oklahoma City, has produced some excellent materials that you can do online, or you can print it out and use it in a hard fashion, but excellent discipleship materials that's based from a holiness perspective, but that is viewed as a problem. Number 4, addressing complex social issues with biblical integrity. Now, I'm not going to look at this one, though I really wanted to dive into this one to a greater degree, but it's going to be dealt with in one of Dr. Dewhurst's seminars more thoroughly. But if you don't think this is an issue, I was preaching Heartland Holiness Camp in near Stillwater, Oklahoma this summer, where Brother Stetler and others are, and was a part of that camp. And I had a broken-hearted parent come up to me because during that camp, one of my former students here was having the transitional surgery going from being a male to a female. And the parents were brokenhearted and at the altar, and a sister-in-law or his sister, who is a pastor's wife, they were at the altar heartbroken because he's saying, well, you're not holy, you're not, because you won't accept, and they are struggling with how you deal with it. If you don't think you're going to face this in the future, you are not very bright. Because as I hold revivals, I face this and the homosexuality issue in almost every church now where I minister. And so many of them that I hear about are even former students of mine. You're going to face it. But listen to me, it doesn't matter if it's your family, if it's mine. One of the things that troubled me, and I'm not trying to harp on it, but how many people will change their views on divorce and remarriage when all of a sudden it's their children? But the Bible is the Bible. We have to love. I love what Chris said. We're not combative. See, I don't have to win the argument, but neither do I have to agree with your decision. One of the things that God has opened the door for me to do when I'm in, I serve as a commercial chaplain with Marketplace Ministries, 67 hours a month, serving about 9 different commercial locations, everything from a doctor's group to Rural King. I mean, you name the spectrum. And one of the things that we had to stop doing is allowing our chaplains to perform wedding ceremonies because of the political climate. We're not going to alter and marry 2 of the same sex, but instead of turning them down and having to deal with the fallout of not being able to serve, or, we just say, look, we don't marry people. And I don't know that I like that, but that's the kind of climate that we're in now. But in several of the locations that I serve, I have people who are even in management who are actively homosexual. Tends to be all of them are lesbians, wouldn't have to be, but they are lesbians. A couple of years ago, I was at a company picnic, and I saw one of them that's in management, and as I go by, just like I do the rest, I tell them I'm praying for them. I don't, they know where I stand. I don't have to preach. But she saw me and waved, and she had her partner with her that day. And so my wife was with me, and I introduced my wife. She introduced her partner, and I was respectful. And it surprised me, her partner was general manager of a healthcare organization, and our chaplains group got a call the next week from that individual saying, we need a chaplain where I work. And here was the statement that meant a lot to me. I know he doesn't agree with our lifestyle, but he treated me with respect and like he cared. And I need that. You understand what I'm saying? We have got to stand for truth. But we have got to stand for truth in a Christ-like spirit. We don't have to justify sin. We dare not justify sin. But we also have to show them a Christ who can still transform from any sin, who can still change a person's life. Addressing complex social issues with biblical integrity. Number 5 was prosperity gospel teaching, 56%. And I just want to say here, this is an easy trap for even us as holiness people to fall into. Now, we may not think of it as prosperity gospel teaching, but it can be a trap. Let me give you an example. John may remember when I was here serving as academic dean, I was also pastoring a church in Frankfurt, and one of my childhood heroes was a member of my church. He had been district superintendent of 3 different districts over the course of his active ministry. Had been the president of the old Colorado Springs Bible College back in the 30s or 40s, whatever, and a great preacher. He and R.G. Flexen preached my grandfather's funeral when he died, and I loved Brother Lacey. When I became his pastor, in fact, Coles, one of your students here, when Brother Lacey died, they bought the home that he lived in right across the street from my house there in Frankfort, and lived there for a few years. But Sister Lacey, Vera, started having minuscule strokes. She was a great lady in her own right and had been a minister along beside Delbert, and was a great lady. But she started having minuscule strokes and became bedfast and became incapacitated until, she just didn't know whether it was night or day. And Brother Lacey, for a while, had to put her in a nursing home there, and he didn't think they cared for Vera like he did, and so he brought her back home, put her in a hospital bed in his living room. And he sat in a chair and literally sat there day and night. He did not go down. The only sleep he got is he would nod off there in that kitchen chair. And because she might wake up at 1 o'clock in the morning needing a drink of water, and she had no concept of day or night. Since we lived across the street about every other day, my wife would make plates up that he could microwave, and I would take them over something to eat. And I saw Brother Lacey as he kept getting more and more and more discouraged. And he started saying something like this: "Boy, Pastor, God has a strange way of paying us back, doesn't he?" I said, "What do you mean, Brother Lacey?" He said, "I've sacrificed," he said, "when Seth Cook Reese appointed me president of Colorado Springs Bible College. Teachers hadn't been paid. He said, I never took a dime salary. My kids nearly starved while I went out raising money, trying to keep that school afloat. I never asked what I'd be paid. When I would accept a church, I never asked what they'd pay me. I never cared." He said, "I went wherever God led me. I did whatever God wanted me to do. Vera and I have done whatever. We've always sacrificed. And now we're down to the end of our life, and this is God's way of repaying us." And one day when he said that, God gave me a check and a little wisdom, I think. Or maybe it was youthful stupidity. But I said, "Brother Lacey, wait a minute. Are you telling me that if we serve God and are obedient, that there comes a point where God becomes obligated to us? That God owes us? That the scales are tipped and it's no longer I owe him everything, but God owes me?" And he began to weep and said, "Oh God, forgive me. Brother Hotle, you're right." And we prayed, and I never heard that anymore. But that's a trap we can fall into. Well, I don't dress this way. I don't do that. I don't do the other. We live better than the people down the street. We do this. So God owes us. Can I tell you, that's prosperity gospel? It is. I can never live good enough that I deserve God's favor. The old English hymn puts it well: "How thou canst love a wretch like me and be the God thou art is darkness to the intellect, but light unto my heart." We can never earn God's favor. Number 6, reaching a younger audience, 56%. And I'm going to tell you, there's one thing that troubles me, and I'm going to just look at this one a moment. I preach a lot of camp meetings every summer. And I have noticed, even in some of our better camps, there is a danger that is now coming back to bite us. Several years ago, we started separating, and we would have teen evangelist and a teen tabernacle. And they were separate. Some camps would have them as a part of the evening service, but many of them, I wouldn't see the teenagers preaching that camp, only possibly once or twice during the camp meeting. But then those teenagers become young adults, and the camp can't understand why they're not coming to camp meeting now that they're getting married and they're young adults. And it hit me. Part of it is they've never been a part of camp meeting. See, my memories of camp meeting, and I still love camps, was laying on my grandmother's knee and hearing the saints as they shouted and experiencing the atmosphere and watching with curiosity as they prayed around the altar and victories were won. But we've got to be careful that while we certainly need to focus ministry on them, that they are a part of the life of the church and that there is not a generational issue. I really believe we have to be careful if we're to reach a younger audience. Number 7, political polarization in the country. And this bothers me. You know what troubles me, and I'm going to be careful here. If you get mad at me, remember that you got to love me if you're sanctified. I am conservative politically. I vote a certain way. But it bothers me how we'll justify things of certain people that otherwise should be totally abhorrent to us as conservative holiness people. Come on. And Chris alluded to it this morning. You know, we begin to fight with the same weapons that the other side fights with. God forgive us. God forgive us. We've got to stand for truth, but we dare not fall into the trap. In fact, my great-grandfather, Frank Hotle, was supported. It's interesting. I discovered while I was here, even and before, he was a missionary to India. He went with the old Pentecost bands, later missionary bands, out of back when the Salem Park Church was the headquarters of that movement. He went in 1894. And while William Smith was here, he and his wife kept a little carton on their table, and one of the ways they supported them was egg money. They would take their money from the eggs they would sell, and they'd put it in that carton, and then every so many months they'd send it to them. When my great-grandfather came back to the States for a while, he was president of Missionary Band's Bible School, and in fact, when my aunt was just young, they attended the same school. Her parents, Inyarts, Sister Edwards' parents, Inyarts, taught there for a while at the old Missionary Band School, and they went to school together. Dr. J. Edwin Newby, who had Newby Book Room and was connected with the school, also taught there, and Victor Glenn's father. But my great-grandfather, in one of the books that he wrote in I believe it was 1907 when he wrote this particular book, made a statement that I liked. If you're right, you need not fight to prove you're right. And if you're wrong, you'll be wrong no matter how hard you fight. And I've paraphrased that. You can fight for the right issue and fight with the wrong spirit, and you're just as wrong as if you were fighting for the wrong issue. You get that? You can stand for truth. You can fight for what's right. But if you fight in a wrong spirit, you're just as wrong. When I was serving here, we had a man who came and preached in chapel. I don't know if Dr. Whitaker remembers it, but he had a nephew who was a student here. He preached the most ridiculous message against men wearing belts. I mean, it was rather ludicrous. And I just laughed about it. And I had one of the professors here came up to me and said, Brother Hotle, why didn't you say something? Why didn't we need to stop that man from ever being allowed to preach here again? I said, brother, I don't need to get upset. I think what he preached was silly, but, if I'm comfortable in my heart, I don't have to react. I don't have to react because I can sift it all through the Word of God. I don't always have to correct the other individual. Well, I didn't mean to get off on all that. Number 8, negative perceptions of the church, 46%. This is what is tragic. Before 1985, confidence in the church topped perception as it was the most trusted institution in America. In other words, when they would rate whatever those organizations were that they had the highest regard for, it was number one. But since 1977, things begin to change. 1977, from that day on, as Gallup has polled annually on this subject, the number has declined. In 1977, 68% of people in society had high confidence in the church. That was the most respected entity in the nation. But it has gone down steadily since 1977. And in fact, since 1980, the numbers have declined until by 2000, less than half. In fact, in the latest survey, 36% of the people have some confidence or have confidence in the church, down from 68% in 1977. But 29% of those surveyed have absolutely no confidence in the church. And it's moved from being the number one trusted entity until now it's absolutely in the middle of the pack. In other words, they will trust a political party. Actually, believe it or not, more people trust the Republicans or the Democrats, according to where they are, than trust the church. And I don't trust either one of them to be anything but liars. But the church has lost its credibility. And here's what's tragic. Again, I said I'm not going to break them all down, and I don't want to get caught into that. But what political party you belong to affects your perception of the church. Listen to what Gallup found in the last survey. 46% of Americans who identify themselves as liberal, the vast majority of them have no confidence in the church. Compared to 28% of moderates or independents who claim they have none, and only 19% of conservatives say they have none. In other words, conservatives still have a high level of confidence in the church, but those who consider themselves liberal, the vast majority have little or no confidence whatsoever in the church. And these are the people that we need to try to reach with the gospel. Number 9, diminished influence of churches in the community. 45% see that as an issue. And let me just say here, we can do something about that. We as churches need to find ways to let our community know that we care. The church that I attend when I'm home, I'm not able to be there all that much. But over the last few years, beginning back when Troy Keaton was pastor there, they have found ways annually. For example, we have a school that's primarily in a poverty area, and our school every year takes coats in the fall to those children that are poor and provides them. We provide backpacks every year. We have a home for unwed mothers that is trying to stop them from having abortions, and we'll fill baby bottles every year in the fall, and we'll have people put their change in those baby bottles, and then we'll bring the directors there and give them a large sum of money to help them. And it's amazing how the perception of the community has changed, not with us changing our message, but just showing them that we're involved in the community. It's important. Number 10, church leader burnout or exhaustion, 40%. And I don't want to deal with this one too much, but it is a problem. And yet, one thing I've discovered, and I want to be careful, Ministry attracts two opposite groups of people: the lazy and the workaholic. And there's a certain class that want to enter the ministry because they see it a good way to get a paycheck while only having to work now maybe Sunday morning and Wednesday night. The other group are workaholics, and I always tended to fall into that trap, I hate to admit. But they go 60 or 70 hours a week off into the neglect of their own family. But you know what I've discovered in recent years? There are fewer and fewer workaholics and more lazy entering the ministry. And even in my own group, you know, we just think every pastor needs a sabbatical every so many years. And what troubles me is people who have to work for a living will look at that and they'll be troubled because they don't get 2 months or 3 months off every so many years and be paid for it. Burnout is a problem, but laziness is also a problem. Enough said. Number 11, changing attitudes towards evangelism. Doing what I do. This one troubles me because I am finding it true even in the conservative holiness movement. Revivals are important. Revivals are not meant primarily to reach the lost, but they are primarily a time for us to review our own spiritual condition and to tune up. That's the primary purpose. Quite honestly, last week I did a Wednesday through Sunday revival, but those are rarer and rarer. About a third of the meetings that I have each year now end up being Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And a large number of them are having what they call one-day revivals, Sunday morning, Sunday night. And I'm getting more and more of those, even among more conservative churches. But I want to tell you, we're cheating ourselves. One of the things that we have lost is we have lost somehow, or we have developed, I don't want to say a fear, but the altar. People used to come to the altar, even in churches that are a part of what we think of as the IHC crowd. I have held revivals in them, and I've heard no one preach or pray except the song leader or the pastor. We forgot how to pray. And they wonder why nobody ever goes to the altar. But we never promote the altar. And you can preach your heart out and feel conviction, but it's like there's a fear of the altar. But we need to have the kind of atmosphere that our people are encouraged to use the altar as a place of tuning up, as a place of drawing close to God. It's not a place of judgment. It's not a place of condemnation. But we need to recognize that this is a place where God meets with us. Don't fall into that trap. Oh, I know a lot of pastors say, well, revivals cost too much. But listen, that will take care of itself. There are a lot of us out there, I don't care what I'm paid. But it is essential to the church. And you know what I've discovered? If God moves, the money will take care of itself. It really will. But don't lose sight of the fact that as Christians, we need periodically to have someone to come in, and we need God to speak, and we need to do spiritual inventory and see where we are. There is this concern, and I think it's a legitimate concern, changing attitudes towards evangelism. Just a few more, and I'm going to just hurriedly look at these because I don't want to keep you the full time. Hostile culture towards Christianity, 36%. Number 13, addressing scandals in the church abuse crisis. And boy, I could get going here, and I don't want to spend too long, but can I tell you one thing I discovered when I was here? We, as conservative holiness people, are just as guilty as the world at trying to sweep things under the rug. Now, I don't mean that we don't want to admit they're there, but we try to keep it as quiet as we possibly can. In fact, I had shouldn't even go here, but while I was academic dean and over the discipline committee, we had an activity, something that had happened. And the minister was, I discovered in a homosexual bar in Indianapolis, and got a call from a former student who was clearly a homosexual, and he wasn't happy with it. And he called because he didn't like, the hypocrisy of it, and we dealt with it. And he did pray. I'm not trying to be judgmental or critical, but you know what bothered me? Within a week, he was back in the pulpit. And I told a member of his family, because they tried to, keep it as quiet as possible. I said, if his wife had cut her hair, you wouldn't allow them to minister until it could grow long enough she could hide it. But because it's not a sin everybody sees. Are you here? We act like nothing ever happened. We have got to be careful as holiness people. We have to deal lovingly and compassionately, but we also have to deal with accountability and providing those helps that are needed. And addressing scandals in the church or crisis, God's got to help us to do it in the right kind of spirit that is restorative, but also not sweep it under the rug. Number 14. A lack of intergenerational relationships within the church. Number 15, 33%, the church's role in marriage. Number 16, increased influence of the media. And boy, I'm going to tell you, I can't get away from it. But the cell phone, the social media has created problems for us that the world has never faced before. And it's affected every area. I'm convinced that it is the primary tool that the devil has used, and yet I, like you, I can't, you have to have it in today's world. And the devil has played it in such a way that the influence of media has affected us in ways that were unimaginable. And God's going to have to help us to find a way to stem the tide and to deal with it. Number 17, religious liberty and freedom, 23%. Number 18, women's role in the church, 23%. Number 19, a diminished influence of pastors in the community. And I'm going to just pause here for a moment. Finding young pastors who will make hospital calls, nursing home visits, or visit their parishioners has become almost an impossibility. God help us. The primary duties of ministering and helping, we have brought this problem on ourselves because we have tried to become almost untouchable, it seems like. Oh, well, we've appointed this one or that one, and they need to do it too, don't get me wrong, but the pastor needs to be there. I was recently called upon to preach a funeral for an individual who had been a board member, a Sunday school teacher, and the stalwart in that church for better than 40 years. But the pastor was on vacation and said under no circumstances was he to be bothered. And the family turned to me and I preached his funeral. But let me tell you something, that pastor in their heart and in their mind is no pastor at all. Because he wasn't there to minister and to care and to help in their hour of greatest need. Diminished influence of pastors in the community. Number 20, celebrity pastors pulling people away from the local church, 19%. Number 21, challenges to the traditional church model, e.g. house churches, online churches. Now again, I'm going to pause here just a moment. I have no problems. I like the fact that we broadcast, in many cases, our services live on Facebook. But you know what I've also discovered that's happened as a result of COVID? It becomes far too easy to justify staying home and watching it on the internet than being active in the church. People who are even a member and normally were faithful to the church will find it far easier 7, 8, 10 times a year to watch it and not be there instead of be there. And so I'm not saying that we don't use the tools, but we've got to be careful to recognize the dangers. Number 22, keeping up with the latest digital and technological trends, 7%. There are situations, there are issues facing the ministry, issues that have never been experienced before. But as I shared last night, I don't want to leave us on the bottom. We're going to look at some of these. But God lives now. And can I tell you, God can make these the greatest days of ministerial effectiveness. I have experienced it. And I'm going to tell you, many times, it's not the people that have been raised in the holiness movement that are experiencing revival. Sometimes they can be the hardest to reach. But there's a generation, there's a world out there that's hungry for the gospel. And it's been amazing to me how many of them are hungry and open and are reachable. And there are some pastors that I am working with that I am seeing witness and reach them. And God is using them in a powerful way. The church can still be the church. But it's also going to have to be as wise, as harmless as, or as wise as serpents, but harmless as doves as we do it. Father, I pray that you would help us in these challenging times to realize that God's power is not diminished, but is efficacious and can make us successful even in these times, in these days. You're still God, and you're still able to save to the uttermost and transform people by the power of the gospel. We can be more than conqueror through Christ. And help us, oh God, to be challenged this week, but also to be stirred with hope and new excitement and energy, and we'll give you praise. Amen.